Ricky, welcome to Rose Carol Washton Long. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me about this topic, what is Expressionism? Part of why we wanted to focus on the question, this larger question of what is Expressionism, is because oftentimes when we think about the artist Fritz Asher, he's considered to be an expressionist. And I feel as though Expressionism as a movement in art history and just as an aesthetic style, as it's come to be associated with the term, is something that is variously understood. So I'm hoping that you can give us some insight into Expressionism as a movement, as a collection of aesthetic attributes, and perhaps some of the history behind that term, Expressionism, and why we're using it today and how it kind of came into wider parlance. So I think the first question I have for you is, what qualities do we typically think of with German Expressionism? If someone said German Expressionism, what do we think of in sort of the broader culture?
Well, I think first, when you think of German Expressionism, you think of the historical movement that was christened around 1911 in Germany and focused on the two major groups of the Brücke, of which Kirchner was the spokesperson, and also focused on the Blau Rider, or the Blue Rider, which Kandinsky was the spokesperson. And they share certain qualities in common, in that they both wanted to use intensification of color and simplification of form, a loose brushstroke, repetition of patterns, and they all shared a common interest in moving away from both the classical Renaissance tradition, naturalism, even Impressionism, using these simplifications of form and intensification of color to express a mood, a feeling, and sometimes transcendental and cosmic concepts. And I would say since the 80s, the 1980s, not only has this particular group been seen as expressionism because of these stylistic qualities, but other groups in Germany after the First World War were also called expressionists. But the term can have a very broader sense than just these historical movements. The term can refer to painters really across the world who use a certain kind of intensification of color that's anti-naturalistic, simplification of forms, and even accentuation of certain forms, such as you see in the angular hip of the Kirchner in the center of the screen, the Kirchner nude with the Japanese umbrella. But you can see these qualities in the very loose, vivid brushstroke. You can see these qualities in painters that may not have technically at the moment been considered expressionists, but use what today we might say are expressionistic qualities of, as I said, non-naturalistic forms.
So,
and I think you find this term neo-expressionist used in the 80s to German painters such as Kiefer, but certainly it's been used all throughout the 20th century and now even in the 21st century to painters, to artists who use that loaded brushstroke, very vivid, intense colors, moving away from the optical world to express internal feelings.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because there's a sort of a contradiction kind of at the heart of a little bit of what you're saying, is that you have on the one hand the term expressionism associated with two very discrete German art historical movements, so making it seem as if German expressionism or expressionism is something that is confined to a very narrow particular time period. But on the other hand, the use of the term and the associations with the term and why the idea of expressionism was put onto these two groups in the first place, this collection of qualities that you were describing, the non-naturalism, the interest in expressing something beyond the visible or visual world, the intense color, all of these components seem as though they could be a more universal designation, a universal definition for the term expressionism. So it's interesting to have that contradiction.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that the term, particularly used with the little e, expressionist,
Mm-hmm.
those have a universal quality.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the term expressionism, often with a capital E, can be used to refer to the historical moment
Mm-hmm.
in Germany before the First World War and after. But that doesn't mean that it's invalid to use the term artists who have expressionist qualities. And it's interesting that you have on the screen some artists who, although they all use bright colors and loose brushstrokes, which can be harder to see on a screen than if you're standing in front of the paintings themselves. But I think you can see that all of these artists use a distortion of form. In Kandinsky's case in particular, the simplification of form and the distortion of form goes to such an extreme that it looks as if there are no figures in the painting at all. And hence the term non-figuration and even abstraction being connected with expressionism. And that term, abstract expressionism, happened to be used actually right after the First World War to refer to Kandinsky's work. And later it was picked up in the United States to refer to the works of Jackson Pollock and other artists who used that explosive color and this very thick brushstroke. And it's interesting that the term took that form in the 40s, 50s, and even early 60s in the United States. That's just an example of how widespread the term expressionism could be.
It's interesting. And it's also, as you're describing this, it's interesting to think about both the limiting power of the name, the designation for a movement, and also the sort of broader potential of it. The fact that you have abstract expressionism as a concept applied to Kandinsky, and then it later becomes something that is almost exclusively thought of, I feel like, in popular culture as connected to the post-war American movement, thinking of Jackson Pollock. You don't always connect Pollock to Kandinsky, at least in popular imagination. And
That's right.
It's interesting to think about the power and sort of limiting currency of a term when in reality its historical origins are it's as a descriptor, same as expressionist as a descriptor. It's how you're approaching something. But when it becomes the name of a movement, all of a sudden it is somehow limiting in a certain way. So it's interesting to think of. I feel as though the artists we think of as German expressionist kind of always are straddling that line between a historically specific and limited movement and then something that has, with lowercase e, as you said, a much wider potential application. across
Right.
generations, really.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you reminded all of us that the term abstract expressionism was used in Germany long before it was used in the United States. So on one hand, there are precedents for everything. And on the other hand, one needs to also distinguish between them. And that's what's so fascinating about, I think, expressionism, that the historical movement had within it two different tendencies. That is the figurative and the more abstract. And I think that's particularly fascinating, that to our eye in the 21st century, we can easily see the figures in the Kirchner and not so easily see the origins of Kandinsky's abstraction.
Absolutely.
But at the time, they were both seen as alarming. They were both seen as threatening to both academic painters. That is, we have to remember that before the First World War, there was a monarchy in Germany, and that monarchy supported the official establishment called the salon, the academic salon. And that's where artists who had been accepted into the monarchy's academy, the school for art teaching, could then exhibit. So most people who were interested in visual arts, I mean, they might look at these two, and instead of seeing figures in one and bright colors in both, but not being able to identify figures in the Kandinsky, they would see both of them as scandalous, as somehow unfinished, as a threat, actually, because of this unfinished quality. Of course, the subject matter in the Kirchner, where the nudes are seen as contemporary figures, not gods or goddesses from Greek mythology, would have made this seem even more scandalous. But beyond even the subject matter, it really was in bright color, using green for shadows, for example, in the Kirchner, or pink on the stomachs, just undiluted color, where you could even see how the brush put on the color, the breasts of the woman in the Kirchner green. Well, to the average person, this is horrifying. And we mustn't forget that both of these were scandalous at the time, and that the artists themselves, in some way, were aware of that. And they wanted so much for the public to come along with them, to understand that this sort of new way of painting could lead them to really a broader understanding of the world. For most of the public at the time, that wasn't the case. But there were, of course, a few critics who absolutely were enamored of these paintings, felt they represent not only a new style, but a new vision, a new way of looking at the world. And I think that dichotomy is important to understand, that in, say, 1911, 1912, when these paintings were first being shown, they were not being shown in the established academic salon that was decreed by the Kaiser to be the place to see art. So they were in small galleries, but small galleries in large cities. Munich, Berlin, Dresden. But they were not shown in rural towns at all at this time. Although at this moment, Germany was a country of middle-sized towns, but these works were primarily seen in only major cities. But the critics, what's so interesting is that the feeling of scandal and even attacks on the establishment were seen by a number of artists at the time as very threatening. That is, it wasn't just the public, it was even some of the artists themselves, academic artists, but even artists outside of the academic tradition, who saw these paintings as, whether they had exaggerated naturalism or seemingly abstraction, they saw these groups as something threatening, and they even attacked them as anti-German, nationalist, and as celebrating the enemy of Germany at that time, and that was France, celebrating French traditions. So I think it's important to remember that even though these artists who were called expressionists, even though they both embraced aspects of figuration, well, the Berkowitz embraced figuration, the Blau Reiter tended more to abstraction, that outside groups, as I said, saw them as too cosmopolitan, that is looking to traditions outside of Germany. And that was very troubling to some of the artists. I wonder if we might have the images of the protest of German artists.
I don't think I have those in this slide, in this PowerPoint, but
oh yes, the one you sent to me, you did.
Oh, let's see, maybe I did. Where am I?
Yeah, here it is.
Oh, here.
Go back. Go back one.
Oops.
Go back one more. Yeah. One more.
No, I think.
No, down. There. It's the one before the Hitler. There, that it is.
Oh,
there
okay.
It is. There's, I think that's a perfect
oh, yes.
example of what was going on in 1911. And in the center, in the in between the two black and whites, you have an oil painting by a man named Carl Vinnet. And this man was not an academic painter. He wasn't really celebrated by the Kaiser. And he was even in small rural group. Some of you may have heard of Borpswede in northern Germany, all of whom thought painting in the countryside would somehow be an alternative to the great paintings the Kaiser liked of either Christian themes or mythological themes or themes that celebrated the fairly new country of Germany, its nationalistic battles. But Vinnet left this rural group in 1903 and painted somewhat by himself. But he did go to different exhibitions. But when he saw both, particularly the Berkowitz artists, he ranted and raved and was so angry that he collected a series of essays, which you see on the right, called a Protest Deutscher Künstler, which means a protest of German artists. And, you know, this is really the beginning of the claim that expressionists were formless, shapeless, without structure. And he used also the argument they were too indebted to France, that galleries, the few galleries, there weren't many galleries like today, say in Berlin or Dresden or even in Munich. But he felt that these galleries were trying to almost capitalize on other nations' traditions, particularly France. And we do have to remember that in the late 19th century, Germany and France had been at war. They would be at war again in 1914.
Mm-hmm.
So this sentiment of artists looking to the enemy really
Mm-hmm.
stung.
Mm-hmm.
But right away, there were critics and other artists who wrote an answer. And that was called The Answer to the Protest of German Artists. And these essays, another group of essays, all defended artists that were in the Brucke and in the Blau Reiter.
Mm-hmm.
So they were defending just not the spokesperson,
Mm-hmm.
but they were defending other members of the group as well, and defending them by pointing out that indeed these artists had form,
Mm-hmm.
they had an underlying structure.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why people might look at these and say that they were shocking, it was because they were basically visually uneducated, that they were too enthralled to the Greek Renaissance tradition that was literally
Mm-hmm.
trapping them in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a wonderful collection of essays that really can be almost a Bible for 20th century modernism, in that it not only explained that there was a real structure here, repetition of colors.
Mm-hmm.
You can see that in these two paintings by Kirchner. The way Kirchner used highlights of yellow, but that thick brushstroke.
Mm-hmm.
And he uses it in the grass, but then he uses it up in the trees and uses it on the bodies. Similarly, in the work of Striding into the Sea, on your right, you see the use of repetition of curve shapes,
Mm-hmm.
all of which can help to unify a painting
Mm-hmm.
and give it a certain sense of structure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, all this would be pointed out by the great art historian Wilhelm Boehringer, who wrote one of the key essays, I may have said this before, in The Answer to the Protest of German Artists.
Mm-hmm.
And he also pointed out that all of the artists who made up the Brucke and made up the Blau Reiter, and there were additional artists who weren't even in this group that Boehringer considered expressionists,
Mm-hmm.
that they also looked not just to France, but they looked to find the kind of underlying qualities that existed in all art.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly, he looked to what he felt was the indigenous art of other cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Not only the folk art of France and Germany, but he also praised what was then called primitive art. Now, we don't use that term today. We would refer, for example, to the sculpture that appeared in the Blau Reiter Almanac,
Mm-hmm.
which was a yearbook that included not only reproductions of the artists from the Blau Reiter, but as you can see, it included examples from oceanic art, which you see over on the right. And it also included other expressionist artists. That is, you see a Kirchner print in the Blau Reiter Almanac,
Mm-hmm.
because they were looking not for national qualities, but for universal qualities,
Mm-hmm.
qualities that lay underneath
Mm-hmm.
all art, no matter how
Mm-hmm.
the art visually looked.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so interesting in the Blau Reiter that they had examples of Picasso,
Mm-hmm.
and they had examples of other Cubist artists, because strange as it may sound, artists like Picasso, a Matisse, as a matter of fact, Fauvis, and other Cubists were included in the first exhibition that was called Expressionism, that took place in Germany, in Cologne, in 1912. And so it's interesting to remember that the universal qualities that some of these artists celebrated were recognized by German museum directors, not all, very few, but the few who did felt this was such an exciting trend, and that the paintings themselves were so powerful that they applied the term Expressionism, not just to German artists, but to French artists like Picasso. And that is also a reminder of why the yearbook of the Blau Reiter would celebrate not just their own group, not just German groups, but groups outside of Germany. Indigenous artists from halfway around the world, artists in the so-called enemy France, from France. So this is a very cosmopolitan and rather fascinating example of a yearbook that was in some ways an advertisement, not just of the specific group, but of the principles of Expressionism. And those principles included not just visual art. They included music, and they included drama and poetry, all of which had some examples in this yearbook. And they had examples from poetry, from drama, from music, for a number of reasons. But they felt that all the different arts working together, if they were committed to some of these new principles of anti-naturalism, and that might seem sharp, attacking, contrapuntal, but in music it even sounded dissonant. But all of that was seen as some way of involving the spectator, which was so key. And that sounds paradoxical, because for most people looking at, say, the cover of the yearbook, they might not see the figure on the horse, who's actually a kind of what we call hidden image that the person who drew this, which was Kandinsky, but with his co-editor, Franz Marc, with his approval, this was meant to give you this kind of hidden image, a kind of key to the meaning of the Blau Reiter, which would remind us that all these expressionist artists in some way use the visual as a way of what they hoped would changing society. And that seems, again, so contradictory. But for them, only by using visual tools that were the opposite of what the Kaiser approved of, only by using these tools could they try for a new art, which they believe could create a new society. Now, this is very utopian.
Of course.
And very messianic.
Absolutely.
But they absolutely all believed that the visual could have that important possibility of changing society. It's certainly true that many artists today feel that the visual is one way of making ideas accessible to people. But certainly the expressionists in their own way were very eager to use these, as I said, what seemed scandalous methods to get the society, ordinary people interested. Now, I just want to say one thing about the purpose of using scandalous methods like unnaturalistic color, like green on breasts, or bright colors that, as in the Kandinsky, that seem to have no meaning. It's so important to be aware that all these artists felt that every stroke, every color, all led to some kind of unique content. Now, Kandinsky, and it may be even harder to understand with the Kandinsky, but he wrote about this because he felt he had to use every means to communicate, not just painting, not just the yearbook, but also written essays to explain why he was using that approach. And he wrote, and I'm sure the Bruca artists would have agreed that if you went to a usual exhibition, people would walk and they would comment, oh, that looks like the tree in Aunt Nellie's backyard. Or, that's a commemoration of some battle, but I wasn't there. For Kandinsky, for other expressionist artists, color that was sharp, that was vibrant, but that would somehow be seen as antagonistic to each other, that maybe could be like a fire alarm to wake up what he felt were the ordinary people. So when he does a little image of a rider on a horse, he is really giving a little clue and hoping that the spectator, he might be a little confused, but he might be drawn in and study it and look, and then he might actually see that the horse and rider on the cover of the almanac had some reference to actually a Christian theme. A Christian theme that he tried to make more universal by leaving out specific attributes. He was actually thinking about St. George and the dragon, and killing the dragon and saving the young maiden in the lower right, who you could barely see. But the whole concept of the horseman, the rider on the horse, leaping in to the painting, and the painting leaping out to the spectator. That was something he hoped that his paintings could bring about.
It's so, Ricky, it's so interesting just to hear your characterization of these movements and those common aspects of the movement, both in reception and in terms of the motivations of the artists associated with these two historical groups. Because in my, in to a certain degree, often we do associate, Bruca and Blau Reiter, they're both grouped as German expressionists, but we tend to think of them, or potentially popular culture tends to think of them as, to a certain degree, two very discrete movements that have two very discrete trajectories in terms of how they began, ended, what was going on in between. But it's fascinating to think about the contemporary reception of these two groups of artists, and how, to a certain degree, by your description, how identical was the response, both positive and negative. The idea that both of these were perceived to be jointly offensive in the same way, and offensive both in terms of countering a salon aesthetic that was favored by the ruling powers, and as sort of politically offensive as these sort of, anti-establishment gestures. And the fact that you have on the other side the defense of the expressionist artists fall into similarly identical categories in terms of that these are colors that are intentionally put down, that this is meant to be a sort of way of opening your mind to a new and ideal vision of the world, that these common qualities that are both on the positive defense and then in terms of on the sort of very aggressively negative response, unite the two in ways that perhaps it is harder for us to see today. As you said, for us, we look at, if we're coming to Kandinsky versus Kirchner, on the surface, if you're doing a standard image comparison, right, someone would automatically say, well, the figures are more, visibly defined in the Kirchner versus Kandinsky, it's harder to find. So it's, the 21st century eye needs to kind of look back a little bit.
That's right. I wonder if you could put up the vector. Let's see, there. I can, that's the image over on, well, my left. Mm-hmm. And I bring that up because here was someone, a critic, who wrote about the Expressionism. And he wrote about both the Brucke and the Blaureiter and other artists as well. But he talked about the differences between them. Mm-hmm. He called the Brucke artists kind of, they used, he said, an extensive expressionism. Mm-hmm. And by what he meant by that is their naturalism. He used their naturalism was sort of the starting point, and they exaggerated that. And he called Kandinsky and the Blaureiter, he said they were more intensive expressionists in that they were more using less, obviously, nature, but they were more inclined to the transcendental. But both groups, the Brucke and the Blaureiter, were using, as that first exhibition in 1912 said, they were both using the simplification of color, the of forms and color, mm-hmm. but also the heightened colors and that thick brushstroke, and also a little bit of the destruction of what looks like optical space. But they were all using this to create emotive feelings. Mm-hmm. More cosmic in the Blaureiter, but certainly using these methods to motivate others. The Brucke in particular, trying to rebel against what they felt were the artificial restrictions mm-hmm. of sexuality, gender, something they were very concerned with. Mm-hmm. And so Fechter felt that the Germans, and here maybe he's being a little bit nationalistic, but he's thinking these particular German artists have a grasp on this use of non-naturalistic color and form and space, creating something that's very positive. And they call that expressionism. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, as you said, that he took the time to talk about the differences and then he's very convincing mm-hmm. in his essays mm-hmm. about what unites them. Mm-hmm. Now, when you talked about historical movements, I thought it might be interesting to just remind your audience of what happens historically mm-hmm. With the degenerate art exhibition in Germany.
Absolutely.
And it's just a moment now where all kinds of horrendous nationalism has reared its head. that we go back and we look at the photographs of this exhibit called Entartete Kunst, or degenerate art. And on the right, we see a photograph of Hitler. They're hard to see. And his assistant, I believe it's Goebbels. And they have taken artists that they think are decadent, and particularly, I mean, German artists, but, or artists who exhibited in Germany, and particularly the Brucker group, but also members of the Blaureiter group and many other artists that they felt were indebted to Expressionism, because Expressionism had many, many offsprings. But the point is, they hung them in a gallery, and they pointed out that these were artists who looked to other cultures like France, but also looked to what they felt were un-German, so-called primitive art. Mm-hmm. And this all led to the degradation of form and structure and complete commercialism, materialism, and they hung
all the evils.
Yes, all the evils according to the National Socialists. And we understand that this exhibit attracted many, many people, and you can see the lines of people outside in the photograph. But it had a number of consequences in strange ways, negative against early experimental, or what we might call avant-garde art, which certainly Expressionism, German Expressionism was. So that although the Entartete Kunst exhibit was actually created in 1937, and it went to many big German cities, they'd been collecting art of the Expressionists, actually burning it, taking it from museums, all through the 30s. Mm-hmm. And this had reflection in this country in a number of ways. One, when many of the artists who were Expressionists left Germany, they were almost considered taboo, even in this country, because they were German, even though they were considered decadent and degenerate by the National Socialists, who we must remember had been voted in by only 33% of the population, but because of all the split vote, the National Socialists got in. But the second point is that even though many artists, Expressionists, left Germany for the United States, when the Museum of Modern Art was considering an exhibition of new trends like abstract art, they tended to celebrate, and this is an exhibition done in 1936 by Alfred Barr, who was then the first director of the Museum of Modern Art. They tended to celebrate abstraction and almost dissociate it from Germany. And the title of the exhibition was Cubism and Abstract Art. Could have actually been Expressionism and Abstract Art. But Barr, although he had had an exhibition in 1931 praising German art, one of the earliest exhibitions in this country that included artists who were called Expressionists, like, say, Max Beckmann, who was certainly called an Expressionist after the First World War. But in this seminal exhibition of 1936, only non-German artists were celebrated. For example, in his famous chart about where abstraction came from, when you see a little part of the chart, he focused not on all aspects of Expressionism, just abstract Expressionism. And that's because Kandinsky, Klee, who was a member of the Blaureiter, were not German citizens.
Mm-hmm.
He did not in any way celebrate those artists who've been called expressionists who were German.
Mm-hmm.
And that was because of the climate in this country, which was so fearful of Germany that he felt he couldn't even celebrate experimental art in Germany.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Ricky, when you're framing it in this way, because between the Degenerate Art Exhibition, the initial reception to the artists, and then thinking about Barr's need to kind of dial down connection specifically to Germany in a post-World War I and leading up to the Second World War climate in America, the degree to which the artists we think of as expressionists sort of got caught in the middle of a whole bunch of national self-definition or not, and that idea of internationalism versus a German national aesthetic, the many different ways in which this movement is kind of defined by other political interpretations imposing some concept of, well, what does it mean to be a German, what does it mean to be German art? What does it mean to produce German art? What does German art look like? And what is the significance of calling something German? So on the one hand, the idea that you have two sort of very different models of sort of denying the German origins of this movement with the Degenerate Art Exhibition, that this is obviously the argument is that this is international and therefore anti-German and anti the sort of National Socialist aesthetic. But then in Barr's case, essentially kind of doing the same thing and erasing that, origin point for the purposes of, to a certain degree, protecting the artists and ensuring that the art can still sort of have an audience and live at the same time. But it's all this, it's a movement that really just seems caught in a project of national self-definition on all fronts, from debut until later reception.
Yes, and I think it's important to also understand that it was also criticized on the left, particularly by the Stalinist communists, who at the same time that Hitler is attacking experimental art and expressionism, Stalin and Georg Lukács, who really wrote aesthetic theories for Stalinist communists, also attacked expressionism of all things and wrote an essay about the significance and decline of expressionism. So it was tarred by both extremists, National Socialism and Stalinist communists. And Lukács, writing for the Stalinist communists, used almost the same kinds of words that the National Socialists had, that expressionism was formless, shapeless, and also decadent. So it's very ironical that how much expressionism was tarred in the 30s and even 40s. And then it's also fascinating about its emergence in the 80s as neo-expressionism, really German artists, but German artists mostly attacking National Socialism. And I think that certainly contributed to the greater interest in artists who are called expressionists, whether of capital E or lowercase e. And I think that certainly also allowed for Fritz Ascher's work to be reconsidered, because he's caught, you can see two works of his on your left, but he was caught in the attacks on expressionism and the anti-modernism, anti-experimentalism. And from the 80s on, there was a more intensive looking at the past, artists who started expressionism before the First World War and then continued after the First World War, but then artists in the 80s. And then I think what's so fascinating about the 21st century is the embrace of so many different styles. You have someone like Gerhard Richter, again, a German artist, but an artist who paints both abstractly and figuratively. And I think that allows for such a greater appreciation of those universal qualities of art
Mm-hmm.
that made Expressionism so important in 1911 and 1912.
Mm-hmm.
That is, that the artists could have the choice to deform the human image, exaggerate color, use repetitive patterns, no matter how unnaturalistic,
Mm-hmm.
but using all these to express ideas aren't just personal, but they often have societal, cultural, and political implications.
Mm-hmm.
And that is certainly greater accepted, I think, in the 21st century
Mm-hmm.
than it was in 1912,
Yeah.
when the term Expressionism was first used.
Yeah. It's interesting to sort of then by this trajectory, you see Expressionism, both its debut, then its sort of evolution in the 30s and 40s, and then in the 80s, the sort of re-embrace into the 21st century. But how you have two currents. You have that one current where art is a political tool of national self-definition in some way, where it's being bandied about for good or for ill, sort of put at the the service of whatever ideology is in power and trying to reinforce its own agenda. And then on the other side, as you're talking about those universal qualities, the freedom to deform the figure, the freedom to have a non-naturalistic figure, a non-naturalistic color. And it's interesting to think about those two poles as kind of progressing throughout the 20th and into the 21st century, as how this movement, both the capital E historical movement and movements, and then the lowercase e expressionism as sort of an approach to art making, sort of evolved along those two poles in tandem throughout the century. And when you bring up Fritz Asher, it's interesting to think about, as you said, well, on the one hand, Asher's time, what he was doing, he was caught up in these debates, these concerns, and ultimately for him, the persecution of the artists who are practicing in this way. And in Asher's case, obviously, because he was Jewish as well. So it was, he is both part of the political use of expressionism, capital E, historical expressionism, and then also part of that lowercase expressionism as this aspiring for a universalizing aesthetic response in some way, or the freedom to create in a way that is evocative, not necessarily of what you see mimetically in front of your face, but in terms of something else, feelings, emotions, sensations, whatever it may be. So you see him also, an expressionist in both senses of how the term kind of evolves. Would that be an accurate thing to sort of think about?
Oh, I would certainly agree, and I think I should mention that even though Kandinsky was in some ways a spokesperson for the Blau Reiter and wrote most of its essays, even though it was edited with the other major figure, Franz Marc, he never felt that abstraction, or this partial abstraction that he did, was the only style. He thought art had to have a content, and any person, any artist who used these universal qualities was important. And he never felt that one direction should be prescribed, but that the artist should have the freedom to choose. So we don't know if he was aware of the work of Fritz Asher, but we do know that he embraced many of the Brucke artists, so it's very likely that he and perhaps other members of the Blau Reiter might have embraced Asher, should they have known his work.
Him. Absolutely. Now, the one thing I wanted to also ask you about is that the historical expressionist movements, as we think of it. I mean, nothing comes from a vacuum. Everything emerges as an evolution from something else. And so, I wanted to ask you, what are the precedents? Where did the expressionist groups, who did they look to, and why, in terms of sort of,
Oh, well,
I'm thinking about
of
where were their
course,
inspirations?
they, whether it's the Blau Rider or the Brucke or Asher, they all look to some late 19th century artists. Now, with the images that we have here, we can see that Kirchner in particular was looking to Edvard Munch. And you can see the simplifications of form and the intensification of color in the Munch, particularly the figures on the bridge. But what's so fascinating is not only seeing the source for the Brucke, but seeing how they differed. You can see the earlier Kirchner, which is in the Museum of Modern Art, the street scene from 1908, that he's using color even less naturalistically than Munch. I mean, Munch has blue for the water, but Kirchner has pink for the street. And that's why I said these expressionists were sort of shocking and scandalous at the time, because they so deviated from even their predecessors like Munch, who were shocking in themselves. And if you look at the famous scenes of, on the left, that's seen from a particular square in Berlin, Potsdamer Platz, those elongation of the two women is so much more elongated, less naturalistic than even in the Munch, and the green face on the woman intensifies the ghoulish quality that Kirchner was trying to express. Now, it's one thing just to point out, these women are now considered, Kirchner was painting prostitutes at that time. And notice the elongated men, much smaller in the background, and all the angular shapes contributing to the tension. But he wasn't just using these angular shapes and the image of the prostitute to criticize society. He was also in many ways identifying with the prostitute as an outsider to establish mores. And he felt, as an artist, so conflicted over having to sell his works, having to work in a gallery, having to deal with the whole selling and buying of art. So he, in some way, thought of this as almost being the artist as being like a prostitute, standing outside of established norms, which just can remind us again of this moment in history when these artists seemed so antithetical to their contemporary society. And I think we have to remember that, as naive and innocent as it may have seemed, they were imbued with this messianic urge to change society through the paintbrush.
And it's a fascinating energy to kind of think about, that these artists were kind of putting forward in all these formats, which again, I love the idea of, well, from our 21st century eye, we have to put ourselves back into that context and think about what this would mean, and think about what this would signify. The fact that, Kirchner was identifying with the figure of the prostitute, viewing the artistic production and, sustainability of his life and career as something akin to a prostitute in some way, that he was that far outside of what social or societal norms would have been, that much of a counter to established, acceptable society. It's something that I think is very hard for a 21st century audience to really connect with without that bit of, that background, with that understanding, without sort of seeing it as he would have seen it, because it doesn't, we're so used to what came next and sort of seeing back in hindsight, and going back as well to the tensions between, the art historical binary of abstract versus figuration, and which one is the more radical. So sometimes we need to sort of retrain ourselves to see this type of figuration as the truly radical, rebellious gesture that it really was in its time. And all of
That's
the
right. Yes. When you asked me before about the origins of Expressionism, I mentioned, of course, the Norwegian artist Edvard Munch, who actually was exhibited in Germany in the late 1890s. But I should mention that both Brooke and the Blau Riders did look at a number of French artists, and that is particularly Kandinsky looked at Matisse. We can see this great Kandinsky, the Improvisation 27, reminding us that even with his titles, he wanted to make reference to music as the most abstract of the arts. At the same time, I just want to tell you that he gave them subtitles because he did want to give clues to the process, and he called this Garden of Love. And in the sketch, of course, you can see the snake, the couple. But the real point is the billowing colors, the otherworldly effect. But the reds, the use of reds and yellows, and the repetition of the patterns is so similar to the Matisse, who, although he didn't call that a garden of love, he did refer to that as a joy of life. That's a sketch for his large painting, Joy of Life. And of course, they're using similar motifs like the couple, but both of them want to evoke some vision for the future, a paradise to aspire to. And of course, you have the Brucke depicting couples in a landscape. They painted in landscapes most of the time that were parks very close to the city that they lived in, but they thought of these as an escape almost from the crowds. And sometimes they even felt the herd-like mentality that they found in cities, reminding us again that although they looked at French art, and not just Matisse, they looked at Cézanne, they looked at Van Gogh, they looked at Gauguin, that they were drawing upon a group of artists that they felt supported their own art. And in addition, I mean, they were looking at what they considered the art of the people, indigenous art, folk art. And they somehow felt that visual art and even sculpture from Oceania, from Africa, from American Indian art, that all these represented qualities that were undiluted by the establishment, and particularly by the monarchies in Germany and, of course, in Russia. So they looked to other artists who they thought were also outsiders. And again, interesting critics. There were a few critics writing books who were picking out people like Cézanne and Gauguin and Van Gogh as predecessors for new art. Munch was seen as a predecessor. So the Expressionists are not just separated from a past or a tradition, but it's a very different tradition than the Greek Renaissance tradition that was so almost cast in stone by the monarchy, by the upper middle class. They might have even said the bourgeoisie.
It's interesting too, just thinking about sort of where that trajectory, what the artists we think of as German expressionists, what they were looking to as precedents, the allies that they found in art historical precedent. But it's also interesting to sort of think about, you know, how this is such an illustration of the many different ways that art can be selectively interpreted by different generations. As in, you're seeing what you want to see within it. You're finding confirmation for your own motivations, and so you have a bit of a. There's always going to be a gap between, perhaps, you know, the what the expressionists saw in Matisse versus what Matisse saw in Matisse's work. Even though both were looking to utopian vision of an ideal society in some way, the difference in what that society meant and what it looked like and how the tools that were being used to convey that are just, you know, in context, quite different from one another. So it's interesting to kind of think about German expressionism as a historical moment, as kind of pointing to all of these issues that we encounter in art history in terms of understanding works of art and artistic movements as discrete or as, you know, universal, or as more, you know, complex entities that go beyond the sort of narrowness of one particular historical time period. So a lot of questions that I think come up with the German expressionists in particular when we talk about them, that kind of resonate without the whole historiography of art history or modern art history, questions that are dealt with today, which is just fascinating to kind of contemplate that significance. I wanted to also ask you, Ricky, about German expressionism after the wars. I mean, obviously, when we were talking about the definition of expressionism and the reception of what we think of as the German expressionist movements during the Second World War and then after, and sort of that as a political tool, this is obviously a movement that is impacted by conflict. And the artists themselves were impacted by conflict. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how the world wars affected this either capital E historical expressionism or little e expressionism in terms of practice.
Well, it's interesting that, again, both spokespersons for the Brucke and the Blaureiter were indeed affected by war. Now, Kandinsky himself said he wasn't thinking of the political war when it actually occurred. He was thinking of some kind of battle between what he called the transcendental or the metaphysical and the actual evil that he felt came from over-commercialization. Kirchner, more specific in his criticisms of society, we can see this in his pictures of himself as a soldier. And the well-known painting on the left shows Kirchner's antipathy to the military. The military, which he shows in the painting in the lower right, where all the sort of ordinary soldiers are crowded next to each other in a shower, and they're watched over by a clothed officer. That sense of lack of individuality, of obeying, was something that he intensively hated about the German Empire and the monarchy. And to show, you know, his reaction to this, he really felt that the war was almost, he felt so viscerally attacked by the military and felt that it affected his art, that he showed himself with a bloody stump for his hand that painted. And the other hand is shown almost like a claw. And then we see how he's elongated his face and made it yellow, sallow. exaggerated the angularity of his nose, pointed even his ears, dark over the eyes, cut off the top of his head to make you almost feel like he's tumbling out at you. And then the vision of what might be his memory of a nude woman, man, somewhat very unclear. But what's so striking about that painting of the portrait of himself, the self-portrait as a soldier, is the shock of that bloody stump. And then how he uses the reds and pinks repeating in the painting to both make it shocking, reds against green, very tension-filled, using the black, blue area behind the nude to push the nude forward, reminding you that this is kind of a memory. And using all these exaggerations of space, color, form, to express his antipathy, his discomfort as a soldier. And that discomfort, that antipathy, somehow enabled him, after he was out of the military, to create this such forceful painting. It's discomforting, it's dissonant, and yet you have to look at it. And of course, that is what he wanted, using these exaggerations of form, the disturbing color, to grab you, to get you involved with that painting, hopefully to have you then question, what is the military doing? And certainly that's something that Kandinsky and other members of the Blau Rider wanted their paintings to do, is to have an effect on the spectator, so they would question what was going on in the world. And perhaps that's the aim of so many artists, but particularly of expressionist artists.
Absolutely. And I think the idea that what you're seeing is the consistency of, to a certain degree, even though the context changed, even though the way, the purpose of impacting and affecting the viewer shifts for the artists we think of as German expressionists, depending on the context, whether it's, in this case, in Kirchner's case, reacting to his time in the military and commenting on it, the techniques, the language, the visual language, and the visual strategies through which these artists are trying to express something, even if that something changes, is consistent, regardless of the imposition of these external factors and external conflicts. And I think, to sort of think back also to Fritz Asher, when we talk about his career trajectory from before the Second World War and the persecution under National Socialism until after, there is a consistency of technique. And it's this idea that, perhaps we put too much weight on the imposition of certain external forces in terms of interpreting the work, when in reality you can find these consistent threads, even though they're differently applied. The techniques that are being used, the approach to form, the approach to how do you get a message across through painting, is still something that is consistent with many of these artists, regardless of the context to which they are responding. So I think it's very interesting to think of Kirchner in that way, by your description of how his work works, really, to try to get his messaging across. So that's fascinating. Well, thank you, Ricky. This is absolutely wonderful, and I think it has really given both a historical perspective on expressionism as a concept, both big E, expressionism as a historical movement, and also little e as a series of qualities and a freedom and an approach to artistic production that can resonate throughout the generations, that isn't necessarily confined to one particular set of decades, for example. So thank you so much for...
Oh, thank you, Elizabeth. Great interviewer.